The snow had been falling since mid-morning, and by the time the last light drained out of the Wyoming sky, it was coming down in solid white curtains that swallowed everything past 10 feet. The kind of storm that didn't ask permission, the kind that killed horses, buried fences, and found every gap in every wall you thought you'd sealed. Nora Whitaker stood at the window of the mercantile and watched it come. She was 24 years old and looked younger than that, slight enough that people in Harrow Creek had a habit of talking over her head as though she weren't in the room, thin enough that Mabel Greer at the dry goods counter had once pressed a hand to Nora's wrist and said, with genuine pity, "Honey, you need to eat more before this country eats you." Her coat hung loose at the shoulders. Her wrists were narrow and pale, and the tendons in her hands stood out when she gripped anything. She'd heard every version of the same assessment so many times she could have written it down herself. Too small, too fragile, not built for this. She turned away from the window. Behind her, the mercantile was warm and crowded. Ranchers waiting out the storm, a few women from town, the smell of damp wool and wood smoke, and the coffee that Walt Pruitt kept on the stove year-round. Conversations moved over her in waves. The price of feed, whether the Holt brothers would make it back from their upper pasture before morning, someone's opinion about the circuit judge scheduled to pass through in the spring. Nora carried a small crate of supplies to the back counter and set it down without making noise. That was something people never seemed to notice. How quietly she moved, how little space she took up, and how much she paid attention while they were busy ignoring her. She'd been listening since she was old enough to understand that small people in loud rooms either learned to listen or got left out of everything that mattered. Walt Pruitt came through the back curtain and stopped when he saw her. He was a broad man in his 50s with a gray beard and perpetually flour-dusted hands, and his expression when he looked at Nora was the same one most people in Harrow Creek wore around her, somewhere between mild concern and mild exasperation. "You heading home in this?" he said. "I'll wait a while." "You shouldn't be out alone in a storm like this regardless." He said it the way he said most things to her. Not unkindly, but with the particular weight of a man who has decided in advance that his assessment is correct. "You want me to send someone with you?" "I'm fine, Walt." He shrugged and went back behind the counter. The conversation moved on without her. She was thinking about the lower ridge. She'd seen tracks in the snow that afternoon, coming down from the east face of the mountain. Small tracks, too small for adults, staggered and erratic in a way that suggested whoever made them hadn't been walking steadily. She'd mentioned it to Roy Lester when she came in, pointed toward the ridge, described what she'd seen. Roy was the closest thing Harrow Creek had to a deputy these days, a heavy-set man who handled disputes with a combination of delay and inaction that he called keeping the peace. He'd listened to her with the expression of a man hearing something he planned to forget. "Could have been deer," he said. "They were boot prints." "Hard to tell in blowing snow." "Roy, they were boot prints. 2 sets, one big and one very small." He'd looked at her for a moment, looked at her coat, her wrists, the way she didn't quite fill out the space she was standing in, and then he'd looked away. "I'll look into it," he said, which meant he wouldn't. She'd known that even as he said it. She'd known the way she knew most things in Harrow Creek, by watching the small movements of people's faces, the way their attention slid away from certain subjects, the way they filed certain voices under not worth responding to. She was fluent in being dismissed, had been since she arrived here 2 years ago, a young widow from Ohio who people took one look at and decided couldn't possibly last. She had lasted. That was the part they kept not accounting for. Now she stood in Walt's mercantile and listened to the storm throw itself against the walls, and she thought about those tracks, and she thought about where they were headed, and she thought about the temperature outside, which was somewhere around 8 degrees and dropping. She picked up her crate, pulled her coat tight, and walked to the door. "Nora." Walt's voice stopped her. "It's getting worse out there." "I know," she said, and pushed out into the storm. "Well," the cold hit her like a fist, not gradual, not easing, just immediate and total, pressing into the gap at her collar, pushing through the wool of her coat as if the coat weren't there. Her breath came out in a burst of white. She tucked her chin down and moved fast, not because fast would keep her warm, but because the crate was heavy, and her arms were shaking already, and she had maybe a quarter mile of open ground before she'd reach the tree line where the wind broke a little. She didn't go home. She went toward the ridge. The tracks she'd seen that afternoon were gone now, buried under an hour's worth of fresh snowfall. But she knew the general direction. She knew the lay of the land east of town, the way she knew the inside of her own small house. Not from maps, but from time spent walking it, studying it, paying the kind of careful attention that people who expect to rely on themselves tend to develop. She'd walked that ridge a dozen times, gathering firewood and late-season plants, and she knew there was a hollow in the rocks about a half-mile up, sheltered on three sides, the kind of place someone small and cold and desperate might think to crawl into. The snow was deep enough now that each step required effort. Her boots broke through a thin crust and sank to mid-calf, and she pulled each foot out and placed it deliberately. She wasn't fast. She was never fast. But she kept moving, which was its own kind of thing. She found them about 20 minutes in. The hollow was exactly where she'd remembered. A shallow scoop in the rock face, overhung enough to keep off the worst of the snowfall. In it, pressed against the stone with their arms wrapped around each other, were two children. The older one was a boy, maybe 10 or 11, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and a coat 2 sizes too large that was soaked through at the shoulders. He had his arms around a girl who was small enough that Nora's first cold shock thought was 4, maybe 5, with pale braids that had come mostly undone and a face that was slack and still in a way that made Nora's chest seize up before she got close enough to see the faint vapor of breath at the girl's lips. The boy looked up when Nora reached them. His eyes were dark and too old for his face. He'd been crying. She could see the dried streaks on his cheeks, tracked through the grime, but he'd stopped. Whatever he felt right now was somewhere past crying. He held his sister tighter when Nora approached, a reflex, pure and animal. "It's all right," Nora said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy said nothing. "My name's Nora. I live down in the valley, in Harrow Creek." She set the crate down and crouched in front of them, getting herself level, making herself as small and non-threatening as she could manage, which wasn't difficult. "What's your name?" A long pause. Then, "Ethan." "Ethan." She glanced at the girl. "And your sister?" "Rose." His voice cracked on the word, just slightly. "She won't wake up. I've been trying to keep her warm, but she won't. She keeps going cold and I don't—" He stopped, set his jaw. He was trying very hard not to fall apart in front of a stranger, and it was the most adult thing Nora had ever seen a child do. "She's breathing," Nora said immediately. "I can see it. She's alive, Ethan. But we need to get her warm, and we need to do it fast." She was already opening the crate. There was a wool blanket she'd taken off the shelf before leaving, not purchased yet technically, but Walt could add it to her account. She wrapped it around Rose first, tucked it under the girl's chin, checked the temperature of the small hands. Cold. Very cold. But not the white, waxy cold of the truly dangerous stages. Not yet. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. "Since—" Ethan counted in his head. "Before it got dark. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know which direction the town was." "Where did you come from?" His jaw worked. "Our pa had a camp up higher. He went out 3 days ago, and he didn't come back." 3 days. Nora looked at this boy who had spent 3 days keeping himself and his little sister alive in a Wyoming winter, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not pity, exactly, because pity had a distance to it, and what she felt had no distance at all. It was more like recognition. "Okay," she said quietly and without fuss. "Here's what we're going to do." Getting them back to town took longer than she wanted. Ethan could walk, barely, though his feet had gone numb enough that his gait was wrong and twice he stumbled. Nora had Rose pressed against her front with the blanket wrapped around both of them, and the weight of the girl, even small as she was, made every step through the deep snow a negotiation. Nora's arms ached, her back ached. The cold had gone past feeling and into something that was more like numbness with a distant, burning edge. And she focused on the placement of her feet and on counting her breaths, because counting was something to do that wasn't panicking. She talked to Ethan the whole way. Not about anything in particular, just kept her voice going, steady, unremarkable, something for him to follow. She told him about Harrow Creek, what buildings were on which streets, which family had the spotted hound that barked at everything, how Walt Pruitt made the best coffee in the territory and kept the pot on all day. She talked because silence in cold and dark does something specific to people, and she needed him walking. "Are you from here?" Ethan asked at one point. His voice was rough and exhausted, but he was keeping up. "Ohio," she said. "I came west after my husband died." He processed this. "How long ago?" 3 years now." "Do you miss it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do with most things. "Sometimes," she said, "but I think I was always trying to get somewhere I hadn't found yet." The boy was quiet a moment, then, "Me too." They came into the edge of town from the east, and the lights of the main street, such as it was, appeared through the blowing snow like something you might not entirely trust. Nora aimed for Walt's Mercantile because it was closest and warmest, and she pushed through the door with Rose still held against her chest and Ethan a step behind. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected walks in. Walt was the first one to move, coming around the counter fast, and behind him, Roy Lester was already on his feet with an expression that was half concern and half something that looked, to Nora's exhausted eye, like a man realizing he probably should have paid more attention earlier. "Good God," Walt said, reaching out to help with Rose. "Where did you—" "East Ridge, the hollow in the rock face." Nora let him take some of Rose's weight, but she kept her arms around the girl because the girl was starting to stir now, making small, distressed sounds against Nora's collar. "Get blankets. Hot water, not boiling, and someone needs to look at both of them. Doc Hensley's on the other side of town." "Then go get him." She wasn't sharp about it. She didn't have energy for sharp. She just said it the way you say things when the answer is obvious. A few people moved. Good. She carried Rose to the chair closest to the stove and sat down with her, and the little girl shifted against her chest, and Nora looked down at this small, cold, unfamiliar face and felt something she would have had a hard time naming then. Not that she would have tried. There wasn't time for that. Ethan sat down on the floor beside her without being told. He leaned against her knee and pulled the nearest blanket around himself and looked at the fire with the eyes of someone who isn't sure yet if it's safe to stop being afraid. Nora put one hand on his shoulder, lightly, and kept it there. By the time Doc Hensley arrived and examined the children and declared them cold and malnourished but not in danger, the crowd in the Mercantile had grown. Half of Harrow Creek had, it seemed, decided to wait out the storm in Walt's back room, and now they were all very interested in the two children sitting beside Nora Whitaker. The conversation that happened next was one Nora would remember for a long time, not because of anything dramatic, but because of how quickly it moved from "how do we help these children" to "where should we send them?" It started with Edna Coffey, a woman of 50 who ran the town's only boarding house and held opinions on every subject with the confidence of someone who has never had to reconsider. She looked at the children, looked at Nora, looked back at the children, and said, "They'll need to be taken to the county seat. There's an arrangement there for orphaned children." "They're not necessarily orphaned yet," Nora said. "Their father went missing 3 days ago. He may still—" "In this weather? 3 days missing in the mountains?" Edna's voice was not unkind exactly, but it had the quality of someone closing a door. "Be realistic, dear." Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at Ethan, who was listening to every word with his face very still. "They don't need to be sent anywhere tonight," she said. "Well, who's going to take them?" Roy Lester asked this with genuine curiosity, as if the answer were genuinely unclear. "You. You can barely take care of yourself, Nora." She heard it land in the room the way a stone lands in water. The small ripple of agreement, the nods that people tried to make subtle. She was aware of herself as they saw her, the narrow shoulders, the coat that didn't fit quite right, the wrists. The person who was very nice, very determined, and fundamentally not enough. "I can take them for tonight," she said. "That's not for tonight." She kept her voice level. "The storm is getting worse. The county seat is 2 days' travel. Nobody is going anywhere tonight. I have a house with a stove and blankets and food, and I am offering to take them for the night. We can have every conversation you want to have in the morning." There was a pause. People looked at each other. Roy looked at Edna. Edna looked at Roy. Neither of them had, it appeared, a strong counter-argument to the children need a warm place to sleep. "One night," Edna said, in the tone of someone granting a considerable concession, "and we discussed this properly in the morning." Nora stood up, still holding Rose, who was awake now, groggy and confused and beginning to understand she wasn't outside anymore, which was producing a low, continuous sound somewhere between whimper and word. Ethan got to his feet without being asked. His eyes met Nora's, and there was something in them she recognized from the hollow in the rock face, that quality of someone who has stopped expecting help and is therefore startled when it arrives. "Come on," she said. They walked out into the snow. Her house was small. One main room with a sleeping alcove, a decent stove, bookshelves she'd built herself with uneven results, a kitchen table she'd repaired 3 times. It smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of the candles she made in autumn. She'd always thought of it as a provisional place, somewhere she was staying until she figured out the next thing. Standing in the doorway with Rose half asleep against her shoulder and Ethan looking at the room with wide, careful eyes, she thought, "It's too small." And then she thought, "It'll have to do." She got the stove going first, big and fast, not economical, and put water on for broth because Doc Hensley had said warm liquids and food, in that order, slow. She made up the bed in the alcove for Rose, who went back to sleep almost immediately with the particular completeness of a small child who has decided the immediate danger has passed, and rest is now the priority. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and watched her work. He was better now, color returning to his face, hands wrapped around a mug of warm water, the worst of the shaking gone. But he was still watchful in the way children who have had difficult weeks tend to be, tracking movements, cataloging exits and options. "You should eat something," Nora said. "I'm not hungry. Eat anyway." She put bread and the last of a dried beef sausage in front of him. He looked at it for a moment, then ate in the careful, methodical way of someone who has recently been very hungry and has not entirely processed that the hunger is over. Nora sat down across from him with her own cup and let the silence run for a while. The storm knocked at the walls, the stove popped and settled. "What happens in the morning?" Ethan asked finally. "People are going to want to make decisions about where you go. The orphanage in the county seat. That's one option." He looked at her. "What are the other options?" Nora turned her cup in her hands. She was thinking about what she was about to say, which was not a small thing, and which she had been in the process of deciding slowly since she found them in the snow. "Someone local could petition for guardianship," she said carefully. "That would require the court to consider it. It wouldn't be decided tonight." "Someone local." Ethan said it the way he said most things, without inflection, watching her face. "You mean you?" "I mean, it's a possibility I'm considering." "Why?" It was a good question. She thought about giving him a simple answer and then decided not to, because he was not a child who would find simple answers anything other than insulting. "Because you kept your sister alive for 3 days in the middle of a Wyoming winter," she said. "That's not nothing. And because when you came down that mountain, you came down together. And I think you've been doing that for longer than 3 days. And because—" She stopped, looked at her cup, looked back at him. "Because someone should." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at her wrists, she thought, at the coat hung by the door, at the small house with its repaired table and its uneven shelves. And she let him look because he was conducting the same assessment she was, and he had as much right to it. "They won't let you," he said finally. "You're too—" He stopped. "Too what?" He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Small," he said, which was clearly not the first word he'd reached for. "The woman at the store, she said, before, when you were with the doctor, she said you couldn't even keep yourself alive out here." "I know what she said." "Is she right?" Nora looked at this boy who had pulled his sister through 3 days of mountain winter on nothing but stubbornness and love, and asked her with genuine want-to-know directness whether the woman who wanted to be their guardian was capable of the job. She thought about Ohio and the years after the funeral. She thought about arriving in Wyoming with $20 and a set of skills she'd taught herself. She thought about Walt's face every time she paid her account in full, a little surprised each time, as if he kept expecting her to fail and then kept having to revise the timeline. "I'm still here," she said. "That's my answer." Ethan looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded, once, with the gravity of a child who has learned to make decisions with incomplete information and live with the results. "Okay, he said. Rose made a sound from the alcove, half word, half dream, and both of them turned toward it at the same time. Outside, the storm kept coming. The morning after the storm came in pale and brittle, the sky a washed-out white that gave no warmth at all. Nora woke before the children, which she'd expected. She'd slept lightly, the way she always did in unfamiliar situations, one ear tracking the sounds of the house. Rose had cried out twice in the night, something wordless and frightened, and both times Nora had gone to the alcove and sat on the edge of the bed until the girl settled. The second time, Rose had grabbed her hand without waking and held it, and Nora had sat there in the dark for a long while before easing free. She got the stove going and put on coffee and stood at the window looking at what the storm had left behind. The world outside was unrecognizable. Drifts had swallowed the fence posts along her property line, and the path to the road was gone entirely. Just a smooth white field where a path had been. The spruce trees at the edge of her yard were bent under the weight of it, and somewhere down the street a shutter had come loose in the night and was knocking steadily against something. The temperature was still low enough that her breath fogged the glass. She heard Ethan behind her before she saw him. He moved quietly for a boy his size. She'd noticed that the night before, the way he came into rooms without announcing himself, the particular carefulness of someone who has learned that drawing attention isn't always safe. "How's Rose?" she asked, without turning around. "Still sleeping." He came to stand beside her at the window. He was wearing one of her wool shirts over his own, which she'd suggested last night and he'd accepted without comment, and the shirt was enormous on him, hanging to his thighs. He looked at the snow with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not quite relief. Something more complicated. "You found us on purpose," he said. It wasn't a question. "I saw tracks earlier in the afternoon." "You told Roy Lester." "I did." "He didn't do anything?" "No." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "But you did." Nora poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one that she set on the table, and then looked at and went and cut with a significant amount of water before sliding it toward him. He glanced at it but didn't object. "My mother used to make coffee," he said, almost to himself. "Used to?" "She died 2 winters ago." He said it without the quaver people sometimes expect from children talking about dead parents. Said it the way you say something you have said enough times that you've worn the raw edges off it. "Fever. And your father's been raising you since." "Trying to." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "He's a good man. He doesn't always know what to do with us. Rose especially. She's little and she needs things and he doesn't always—" He stopped, started again. "He was better in the summer." Nora heard what was in that sentence and left it alone. "We'll send someone up to look for him today," she said. "When Roy gets organized, he'll have to. There are men in this town who know the East Face." Ethan nodded. He looked like someone who has already had the private conversation where he accepted a thing he couldn't accept in public. They drank their coffee in silence, and after a while Rose appeared in the doorway of the alcove wrapped in the blanket, her hair completely undone now, and her face puffy with sleep, and she looked at Nora with the suspicious assessment of a 5-year-old encountering a stranger in an unfamiliar place. "Where are we?" she said. "A house," Ethan said. "A warm one. Come here." Rose came to her brother, and he put his arm around her, and she looked at Nora over his shoulder. "Are you the lady from the snow?" she asked. "I am," Nora said. Rose considered this for a moment, then, "You're small." "Rose," Ethan said. "It's all right," Nora said. "I am small. Do you want breakfast?" Rose thought about it. "Yes," she said. And that, apparently, was that. The meeting at Roy Lester's office happened at 10 in the morning, and Nora had known it was coming and had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things she couldn't avoid, by showing up early, sitting in a chair that had a clear sightline to everyone else in the room, and keeping her expression quiet. Edna Coffey was there, which she'd expected. Doc Hensley, which made sense. 3 of the town's elder ranchers whose names carried weight in any local dispute. Gerald Marsh, Tom Alcott, and Francis Brewer, who was 70 years old and had been opining on every significant matter in Harrow Creek for the last 4 decades. Roy sat behind his desk with the air of a man hosting an event he'd rather not be hosting. The children were not there. Nora had left them at her house with a lock she trusted and enough food for the morning, and Ethan's clear, unspoken understanding that she'd be back. "The question," Roy said when everyone had settled, "is what's best for the children." "The county orphanage," Edna said before anyone else could speak. "It's the proper arrangement. They're equipped for this. Everyone has been very kind, but we can't pretend that an appropriate temporary solution is a permanent one." "Who said anything about permanent?" Nora said. Edna looked at her. "You petitioned Roy this morning for guardianship. I filed a letter requesting the court consider it. That's not a judgment. It's a request for the process to happen here instead of them being sent to a county institution before anyone has tried anything else." Nora. Gerald Marsh said her name in the tone of a man who is about to explain something to someone. He was 60, silver-haired, had run cattle in this valley for 30 years, and he had the particular patience of men who have never had to fight for the right to be heard. "We appreciate your concern for those children. We do. But what you're proposing takes time and resources. You live alone in a one-room house. You have a small income. The winter isn't half done. And with respect," his eyes went to her briefly, the same inventory everyone seemed to do, "you're not in the strongest position yourself." "I know what I look like," Nora said. "I'm not talking about how you look." "You're a little bit talking about how I look." A small silence. Frances Brewer, to Nora's surprise, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "The point stands," Edna pressed. "Those children need stability. They need not to be put in a wagon and driven 2 days to a county seat in the middle of February," Nora said. "Can we at least agree on that? Can we agree that the road isn't passable right now and that the practical reality is that they're here and someone in this town needs to take responsibility for them until a proper legal process can happen?" Another silence. This one had a different texture. "Someone in this town," Tom Alcott said slowly, like he was picking words up off the floor and examining them. "You have someone in mind besides yourself?" Nora had thought about this. She'd thought about it the night before, sitting in the dark with Rose's hand in hers. She'd made a list in her head of what a court would require: stability, resources, a proper dwelling, a demonstrated ability to provide. And she'd gone through every name in Harrow Creek she could think of. And she'd arrived at an answer she didn't particularly like but couldn't argue with. "Cole Mercer," she said. The room changed. It wasn't dramatic. No one shouted or knocked anything over. It was more like the air pressure shifted, the way it does before weather. Several people looked at each other. Roy Lester looked at his desk. Edna Coffey's mouth went thin. "Cole Mercer," Gerald Marsh repeated, with the inflection of a man confirming he'd heard correctly. "He has the largest property in the valley, a sound structure, adequate resources. He's been here long enough that any court would have to take the claim seriously." "He hasn't spoken to anyone in this town in over a year," Edna said. "I know. He ran Frank Dunning off his property with a rifle last spring. Frank Dunning was trying to survey his land without permission. Most men would have done the same." Nora kept her voice even. "I'm not saying Cole Mercer is easy. I'm saying he's viable, and right now viable is what we need." "And you think he'll agree?" Roy asked. "I think I can talk to him." The look on Roy's face suggested he found this unlikely. The look on Frances Brewer's face suggested something different. Assessment, she thought. The old man was actually thinking about it, which put him ahead of most people in the room. "How?" Roy said. "By going and talking to him." She held Roy's gaze. "Unless someone else would like to volunteer." No one volunteered. Cole Mercer's ranch sat 7 miles north of Harrow Creek, up a road that was more suggestion than fact in good weather, and nearly invisible now under 2 feet of new snow. Nora borrowed Walt Pruitt's horse, an enormous phlegmatic roan named Biscuit, who had the disposition of an animal that had seen everything twice and was no longer interested, and rode out at noon with her coat buttoned to the chin and a specific, focused determination that she recognized in herself as the thing that sometimes passed for courage. She'd heard the stories about Cole Mercer the way everyone in Harrow Creek had heard them, which was to say she'd heard a lot of versions of the same general shape. A man who'd come here years ago from somewhere further east, who'd built his ranch with a crew he'd brought himself, and then mostly kept apart from town life, who had a temper that showed itself rarely but memorably, who'd lost a wife to a difficult birth 3 years back and had since reduced his interaction with the rest of humanity to the bare minimum required for commerce. Dangerous, some people said. Unsociable, said others. Has reasons for the way he is, said a few, which was usually the most honest version of any story. She'd seen him twice, both times at a distance. He was big, not fat, big, with dark hair going gray at the edges and the particular economy of movement of men who have spent years doing hard physical work without an audience. He'd looked, both times, like someone who was tolerating the presence of other people as a temporary inconvenience. She rode through the gate of his property with a specific decision not to be nervous, which was not the same as not being nervous. The house was larger than she'd expected. Well built, actually, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that showed signs of recent maintenance. There was smoke from the chimney, horses in a corral to the east, a barn with good new timber on the east face, where something had apparently been repaired. The place had the look of a man who kept things up, not because he had help, but because he minded disorder. She was halfway to the porch when the door opened. Cole Mercer looked at her from the doorway. He was wearing a canvas work coat and had apparently been doing something with his hands before she arrived. There was grease on his right palm that he'd tried to wipe off. He looked at her, then past her at the borrowed horse, then back at her. "Help you?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Not unfriendly, exactly. Just stripped down, the way some men's voices get when they spend most of their time without anyone to talk to. "My name is Nora Whitaker. I live in Harrow Creek." "I know who you are." He said it without judgment, just fact. "Then you probably know why I'm here." Something moved in his expression. "No," he said. "I don't. 2 orphaned children were found on the East Ridge last night. I brought them into town. The county wants to send them to the orphanage and the county seat, but the road won't be passable for weeks. And the people in town have decided—" She stopped, reorganized. "I've been trying to petition the court for local guardianship, but the court is going to want more than I can provide alone. A stable situation, resources, a proper house." Cole Mercer looked at her for a long moment. His face was not an easy face to read. Not closed, exactly. More like a face that had learned to keep its conclusions internal. "You want me to take in someone else's children," he said. "I want us to petition jointly. I would provide the day-to-day care. You would provide the legal stability and the property. It would be temporary while the court processes the petition. You've got this all worked out." "I've thought about it." "Have you considered," he said slowly, "that I might not want children on my property?" "I've considered it." She met his eyes. "I'm here anyway." Another silence. He looked past her again, out at the snow, at some distance she couldn't see. "How old?" "The boy is 10 or 11. The girl is 5. "And their father?" "Missing, 3 days in the mountains in the blizzard." She said it straight, no softening. He'd want the honest version. Cole Mercer stepped back from the doorway. Not an invitation exactly, more like a man who had decided the conversation required being inside. She took it as an invitation and followed him in. The interior of the house surprised her. She'd expected sparse, a working man's house, functional and bare. But there were books on a shelf near the window, an actual rug on the floor, a table with 4 chairs that suggested someone had once expected company, even if they'd stopped expecting it. There was a photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. She didn't look at it directly. He gestured at one of the chairs. She sat. He remained standing, which she didn't take personally. "The town sent you," he said. "The town didn't send me. The town voted to send the children to the county seat. I came here myself. To ask me to do something the rest of them wouldn't." "Yes." He turned and looked at the window for a moment. She waited, because she'd learned that men like Cole Mercer, men who had made themselves into islands, tended to need time that felt like silence before they could make any decision that involved other people. Pressing was the wrong strategy. She let the quiet sit. "What makes you think the court will listen to either of us?" he said, finally. "Because the alternative is a 5-year-old girl and her brother riding 2 days to an institution in the middle of February, and any judge with basic humanity will prefer not to be responsible for that outcome." She paused. "And because if we both sign the petition, your name, your property, your standing in the county, the court has a reason to delay the removal order. It buys time." He looked at her. You've done this before. No, but I've read enough. His expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent. What happens if the court says no? Then I figure out the next thing. She said it simply, without bravado. That's all I ever do. Cole Mercer was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't entirely recognize, like he was recomputing something. She let him. I'll need to meet them, he said, before I sign anything. Of course. And if the boy's difficult, he's not difficult. He's scared and he's 10 years old and he's been holding everything together since his father disappeared, and the best thing you could do is not treat him like a problem. She said it without heat, just statement of fact. He's a good kid. Rose is... She thought of Rose at the breakfast table, suspicious and assessing and small. She's 5 and she's been through a lot, but she eats well and she warms up fast. Something happened in Cole Mercer's face. She wouldn't have caught it if she hadn't been watching carefully. A small give, somewhere behind the eyes, the kind that surfaces in people who have been trying not to think about something and then find it thought anyway. He turned back to the window. I'll ride into town with you, he said, to meet them. It was an agreement, not fully, but it was the next step, and Nora had learned long ago that the next step was the only step that mattered. This is not. The reaction in Harrow Creek when Cole Mercer rode in beside Nora Whitaker that afternoon was the sort of thing that would be talked about in the valley for some time. People came to doorways. Walt Pruitt appeared on the mercantile porch with his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth. Edna Coffey, passing on the other side of the street, stopped entirely and stared with an expression that suggested she was reassessing several prior assumptions simultaneously. Cole rode without acknowledging any of it. He tied his horse at the post outside Nora's house and followed her to the door with the studied disregard of a man who had made a long practice of not caring what anyone thought of him. Inside, Ethan was at the table working on something. He'd found a pencil and a scrap of paper and was drawing, she saw, a rough map of something, or trying to. He looked up when they came in, and his eyes went immediately to Cole, cataloged him in roughly 2 seconds, and became very still. Rose was on the floor near the stove with a folded blanket, playing something involving 2 spoons and elaborate narration. She didn't look up. Ethan, Nora said, this is Cole Mercer. He owns a ranch north of town. Cole looked at the boy. The boy looked at Cole. 2 individuals conducting the same assessment of each other with complete mutual transparency. You the one who kept your sister alive 3 days in the mountains? Cole said. Ethan's chin came up slightly. Yes. How'd you build a fire? Flint from my paws pack, and I made a windbreak from branches. A pause. It kept going out. In that wind it would. Cole looked around the room, not the surveying look of a man judging, more the practiced look of someone who notes conditions out of habit. You know anything about animals? Cattle? Ethan blinked, apparently not expecting the conversation to go this direction. Some. My pa had 2 horses. Cole nodded. It wasn't approval exactly, just acknowledgement. The currency of men who don't spend approval carelessly. Rose had looked up by now. She was watching Cole with the direct, unguarded stare of a 5-year-old who hasn't yet learned to pretend she isn't staring. You're big, she said. Rose, Ethan said, for what Nora suspected was not the first time in his life. Cole looked down at the girl. Something in his face went through a change she couldn't describe. Not softening, exactly, because that would have been the wrong word for it. More like something that had been locked, finding the mechanism worked. I am, he said. Just that. Rose seemed to find this satisfactory. She went back to her spoons. Later, when Ethan had taken Rose to the alcove for what Nora had diplomatically called a rest, Cole stood in the middle of the small room and looked at the place. The uneven shelves, the repaired table, the coat by the door, and then he looked at Nora. You can't raise 2 children in here, he said. I know. My ranch has 3 rooms that aren't being used. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. This isn't what I do, he said. Having people around, it's not... He stopped, started differently. I'm not good at it. I'm not asking you to be good at it, Nora said. I'm asking you to provide a roof and a property line and a signature on a legal document. The rest is my problem. He was quiet for a moment. And if you can't manage the rest, then I'll tell you. She held his gaze. I won't pretend I can do something I can't. That's not how I operate. Cole Mercer looked at her for a long time, the same recomputing expression from his kitchen that afternoon. She let him look. She was used to it by now, the specific way people looked at her when they were trying to square what she was saying with what she appeared to be. Usually they resolved it in one direction. She had found, over time, that people who resolved it in the other direction were the ones worth knowing. I'll sign the petition, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me. I don't want thanks. He picked up his coat from the chair. I want you to be honest with me. If something isn't working, I want to know before it's already wrong. That's fair. He stopped at the door. And Nora. She looked at him. You should know that I'm not easy to live near. I've been told that more than once. I've been told I'm too stubborn to survive out here, she said. Seems like we're both getting poor assessments. He was quiet for a moment. Then he opened the door and went out into the cold, and she heard his boots on the path, and then the sound of his horse, and then nothing but the wind. The days that followed were not smooth. She hadn't expected smooth. The petition was filed with the circuit court through Roy Lester's office, both signatures, Cole's property listed as the proposed household. Roy had processed it with the particular expression of a man handling paperwork he didn't entirely believe in, but he'd processed it. The removal order for the county seat was suspended pending review, which bought them, the lawyer who handled county business in Harrow Creek estimated, 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks felt like no time at all. Nora moved the children to Cole's ranch at the end of that first week. She'd agonized about it, about leaving her house, about what Harrow Creek would make of the arrangement, about what Cole Mercer would make of it. And then she'd stopped agonizing about it and packed her things and gone, because there was no version of this that worked where she stayed in her one-room house 7 miles away from the children she was trying to care for. Cole had given them the 2 eastern rooms, one for the children, one for her, and had made exactly zero comment on the arrangements. He'd cleared the rooms of the tack and stored supplies that had accumulated in them over apparently more than a year, carried everything to the barn without being asked, and left a small woodpile inside each door. That was his version of welcome. Ethan had taken to the ranch with the quiet intensity of a boy who has found something he understands. He followed Cole to the barn in the mornings without announcing himself, started working without being told what to do, and asked questions in a specific, careful way that suggested he was thinking 3 questions ahead of the one he was asking. Cole, to Nora's observation, answered him. Not warmly. Cole didn't do warm, but honestly, and with the full answer rather than the short version, which she thought was probably what Ethan needed. Rose was harder. Rose had nightmares, the kind that came in the early hours and landed her sitting upright, with her hands fisted in the blankets, not screaming, which would have been easier, but silent and rigid in a way that was worse. Nora slept with the door between their rooms open, and she came each time, and she sat on the edge of the bed and talked in a low voice about ordinary things. The horses in the corral, what she planned to make for breakfast, the way snow looked in the moonlight, until Rose came back from wherever she went and folded back down into the pillow. Why does she do that? Ethan asked one morning carefully, when Rose was outside and out of earshot. She went through a lot, Nora said. Her mind is working through it. She wasn't like that before. Before Pa went. She didn't used to do that. It might take a while to stop. He looked at his hands. What if it doesn't? Then she'll have people around her anyway. That's what matters most. He was quiet, the particular quiet of a boy trying to decide whether to believe something comforting. She didn't push it. Belief has to come on its own schedule. The cold continued, and the supplies ran lower than she'd expected in the first 2 weeks. 4 people used more than one, a thing she'd calculated in the abstract and found harder in practice. Cole made a supply run to Harrow Creek in the 3rd week and came back with more than she'd asked for and said nothing about it. She added it to the mental ledger she was keeping and said nothing back. The town's opinion of the arrangement ran through Nora's awareness the way background weather does. Present, acknowledged, not particularly influential on immediate decisions. Edna Coffey had made her position clear before they left and hadn't changed it. A few women had come to Nora quietly and told her they admired what she was doing in the particular way people admire things they believe will fail. Walt Pruitt had gripped her hand when she stopped for supplies and said, "You know where I am. which was the most useful thing anyone said to her. Roy Lester had told her, the day before she moved out to the ranch, that the county had received a letter from a man named Douglas Whitmore, who claimed to be a relative of the children's mother. Whitmore was asking about the status of the children and had expressed interest in their welfare. Nora had written down the name and said nothing about it. She sat with it that night after the children were asleep, in the main room of Cole's house with the stove low and the wind against the windows, and the particular stillness of a place that is genuinely far from anywhere. Douglas Whitmore. She'd asked Ethan, carefully, whether he knew anyone by that name. Ethan had thought about it and said his mother had a brother somewhere east, someone his parents had never spoken about with enthusiasm. Somewhere east, asking about the children's welfare. She didn't know enough yet to know what it meant, but she knew enough to know it wasn't nothing. She put the paper in the box where she kept important documents, and she went to check on Rose, and she came back and sat in the chair by the stove and watched the fire through the grate until her eyes got heavy. Outside, the temperature kept dropping, and the mountains stood white and enormous in the dark, and the ranch sat at the edge of them like something small that had decided, for reasons of its own, to hold its ground. The name Douglas Whitmore sat in the back of Nora's mind the way a splinter sits in a finger. Not always painful, but never entirely forgotten either. She'd written to the county clerk the same week Roy told her about the letter, asking for whatever information had been provided, and received back a short reply that said the man had identified himself as a maternal uncle of the children residing in Cheyenne and had indicated he would be in contact with the circuit court when weather permitted travel. When weather permitted. It was a phrase that bought time without promising it. February moved through the valley the way February does in Wyoming, with complete indifference to human plans. The snow that had come with the blizzard stayed, was added to, consolidated into a hard pack that made the road to Harrow Creek navigable only in the middle hours of the day when the sun had worked on it a little. Cole made the trip twice a week with the larger horse, and Nora made it once, on Tuesdays, which she designated in her head as the day she handled town business, correspondence, supply gaps, the ongoing paperwork that the court petition seemed to generate in endless incremental quantities. The children settled into the ranch the way children settle into things when they don't have other options. Not happily, exactly, at first, but with the particular pragmatism of young people who understand at a bone-deep level that they are not in a position to be difficult. Ethan helped in the barn every morning and had developed, by the third week, a working relationship with Cole that Nora could only describe as two people who communicated mostly in tasks. Cole would say, without preamble, the gray mare's left rear needs checking, and Ethan would go check it, and when he came back he'd report what he found, and Cole would nod and tell him what to do about it. And that was the shape of their interaction. Functional, sparse, and apparently satisfying to both of them in ways that actual conversation hadn't been. Rose was different. Rose existed in a register that Cole clearly found harder to navigate. She was 5, and she talked constantly, and she asked questions about everything in the immediate vicinity with the specific, unanswerable thoroughness of young children. Why is the horse that color? Why does the snow make that sound? Why does Cole's face look like that? Nora, what is Cole thinking? Nora, does Cole like us? And Nora answered what she could and redirected the rest and watched Cole out of the corner of her eye when Rose was near him. He wasn't unkind. He was just clearly a man who had not had a 5-year-old anywhere near him in some time and wasn't sure what the correct responses were. He answered Rose's questions with the same directness he answered Ethan's, no elaboration, no softening, which turned out, to Nora's quiet amusement, to work fine. Rose didn't seem to need warmth from Cole the way she needed it from Nora. She just needed him to answer, and he did. The nightmares continued through most of February. Not every night. Every 2 or 3 nights, sometimes longer gaps, and then a cluster of them that came several nights running and left Rose tired and quiet in the mornings and left Nora tired in a different way. The accumulating tiredness of disrupted sleep that doesn't fully repair between rounds. She didn't complain about it. There was no audience for complaint, and she wasn't sure what complaining would have accomplished anyway. Cole noticed. She was certain of that. He was a man who noticed most things, just didn't necessarily do anything visible about them. What he did was start making sure there was always a pot of coffee ready before she came downstairs in the mornings, which was not a conversation she'd initiated and not one she felt the need to have. The second week of March brought a thaw, 4 days of temperatures above freezing that sent water running off every roof edge and turned the ranch yard into a negotiation between mud and ice that was brutal to walk through. Everyone was slightly lighter during that stretch, even Cole, who walked through the yard with 2 inches less tension in his shoulders. The children ran outside for the first time in weeks, and Nora stood on this porch and watched them, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A kind of quiet fullness that she wouldn't have known what to call if she'd been asked. Then the thaw broke, and the cold came back harder than before, and on the 14th of March, a second storm rolled in from the north and pinned them to the ranch for 6 days. This storm was different from the February blizzard. Less snow, more wind, the kind that doesn't let you forget it's there, that gets into every gap and makes the walls of the house groan at odd hours and sends smoke sideways from the chimney. The temperature dropped to somewhere below what the thermometer outside Cole's door was equipped to measure, and the horses in the barn needed checking twice a day to make sure the water hadn't frozen solid. Nora ran the household on a system she worked out in her head during the first day and implemented without announcing. She inventoried every supply the first morning, calculated what they had against what they needed for 12 days, optimistic projection, she told herself, and cut it to 10, and then made a schedule that she kept in her head and executed with the kind of quiet persistence that nobody much noticed because it looked from the outside like things simply working. The firewood was a problem. They'd come into March with what should have been adequate reserves, but the late cold snap had eaten through more than she'd planned, and by day 3 of the storm they were drawing on the emergency stack Cole kept in the barn. She told him the evening of day 3. "I know," he said. He was at the table with a piece of tack he was repairing, his hands moving with the efficient certainty of a man who does things by feel. "I checked it this afternoon. We should ration the main stove. Use it for cooking in mornings, let the bedroom fires go during the day." He looked at her briefly. "That's cold for the girl. She can stay in the main room during the day. We all can." He thought about it, nodded. That was how decisions got made in that house, practically, without ceremony. She'd found over these weeks that she appreciated that. She had a complicated history with being talked over in group settings, with having her assessments dismissed before they were tested, and Cole's method, which was basically to listen, consider, and either agree or say why he didn't, had a logic she could work with. The children adapted to the smaller radius of the storm days with varying success. Ethan was fine. He read, he helped where he could, he did the arithmetic exercises Nora gave him at the table in the afternoons with the focused compliance of a boy who understood that learning was something he could control even when everything else wasn't. Rose was harder. Rose needed movement in the way some children do, needed to run and be loud, and being confined to one room for days required management that cost Nora more energy than the firewood situation. She invented things. A game involving folded paper and a set of rules she made up on the spot and revised when they stopped working. Stories told aloud in the evenings. She was a decent storyteller, had found that out by accident when she ran out of other ideas one night and simply started talking, and Rose had gone from restless to still within 2 minutes. Ethan pretended not to listen from the other end of the room and then asked questions afterward. Cole listened too. She knew this. He sat with his work in the evenings and didn't look up and didn't comment, but she'd caught him once, just once, with his hands still and his eyes slightly distant, in the way of someone following a story in their head. On day 4, the wind got bad enough that they could hear something banging irregularly from the direction of the barn, a shutter or a door, she couldn't tell. Cole said he'd go check it, and Nora said she'd come, and he said no. And she said there's more to check than one person can do quickly in that wind. And there was a brief argument that she won on the grounds of being factually correct. They went together, bent almost double against the wind, and found that the east barn door had blown partially off its top hinge and was swinging on the lower one. Cole held it, and Nora handed up tools and held the lantern, and it took 40 minutes because the cold made everything take 3 times as long. And by the time they got back inside, both of them were shaking, and Ethan had put water on the stove without being asked. They sat at the table and thawed out, and nobody said anything for a while. "You didn't have to come," Cole said, finally. Not grudging, just noting. "You would have been out there twice as long," Nora said. He looked at his hands around the cup. "Probably," he said, which was as close as Cole Mercer came to saying thank you. That night she was up with Rose for the second time. Another nightmare, this one longer than usual, Rose locked in that silent, rigid place for nearly 10 minutes before she began to come back. Nora sat with her and talked in a low voice, and at some point became aware that Cole was standing in the doorway of the main room. Not coming in, just present. A large shape in the dark, checking that things were handled. She looked at him. He looked back. He went back to his room without a word, and she stayed with Rose until the girl's breathing slowed and deepened and her hands unclenched. And then Nora sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about a lot of things she didn't have words for yet. The letter from Douglas Whitmore arrived on the 22nd of March, delivered by Roy Lester personally, which was how she knew before she opened it that it wasn't routine. Roy came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning when the road had cleared enough for it, and he handed her the envelope with an expression that sat somewhere between sympathy and relief. The particular relief of a man handing someone else a problem. "It came through the court," he said. "Official correspondence. I thought you should have it as soon as possible." She opened it at the kitchen table after Roy left, with Cole standing by the window and the children in the barn with a task she'd invented to give her time to read without an audience. Douglas Whitmore wrote in a formal hand, in language that had a lawyer's fingerprints on it without quite admitting to being a legal document. He expressed his deep concern for the welfare of his deceased sister's children. He noted that as their nearest living maternal relative, he felt a profound responsibility toward their future. He indicated that he had been in consultation with the circuit court regarding the existing petition for guardianship and wished to put forward his own claim, which he believed this court would find compelling given the advantages he could offer. A settled life in Cheyenne, established business interests, a proper household, and the blood connection that he argued no unrelated party could substitute for. He was careful never to say anything directly unkind about Nora. That was how she knew he was dangerous. People who are unkind by implication have thought about it more carefully than people who are unkind directly. She put the letter down. Cole looked at her. "What does it say?" She told him, not summarizing, giving him the actual content because she had found he preferred actual content. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his more useful qualities. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Cheyenne," he said, "what do you know about him?" "Nothing. Ethan said his mother had a brother the family didn't speak about warmly. That's everything I have. A brother they didn't speak about warmly, who is now very interested in 2 children who've been living on a ranch in the middle of Wyoming." Cole turned the word over in his expression. "What does a man in Cheyenne want with 2 frontier children?" "I don't know, but he's filed a claim with the court, which means we have a hearing date coming, and we need to show up to it with more than we have right now." She looked at the letter again. "He has a blood argument. We have 4 months of keeping them alive," Cole said. "The court is going to weigh that against a biological relative with financial resources." She was being honest about the math because she needed to be. "It doesn't automatically win." Cole crossed his arms. She'd learned his body language by now well enough to read that particular posture. Not defensive, thinking. "Then we find out what he actually is," he said. "Because a man who hasn't seen his sister's children in years doesn't file a formal custody claim out of family feeling. There's something else." She'd already been thinking exactly that. "I need to write to someone in Cheyenne, someone who can ask questions without announcing why they're being asked. I know a man, former business acquaintance. He's not someone I'd choose to call a favor from, but he's thorough." "Would he do it?" Cole's expression did something complicated. "For a price. He does everything for a price, but he'd do it." "Then write to him." He looked at her for a moment, the same recomputing look she'd learned to recognize. "You're not going to ask me what the price might be? I assume you'll tell me if it's something I need to know about." She met his eyes. "And I trust you to make that judgment." He was quiet for a moment in a different way than usual. Not the thinking quiet, something else. He looked away first. "All right," he said. "I'll write tonight." She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the box with the other documents. She sat there for a moment with her hand on the lid. She'd known this was coming. Not this specifically, not Whitmore specifically, but something like it. She'd known since she found the children in the snow that there would be people and systems and arguments arranged against her, because there always were, because that was the consistent experience of being small in a world that respected size. She'd learned to see it without being surprised by it. And she'd learned that the answer was never to pretend the obstacle wasn't there, but to look at it directly and figure out what it was actually made of. Whitmore's letter was made of legal language and implication, and the assumption that a biological claim would override everything else. She needed to know if there was anything underneath it. She went to the barn to find the children. Quote, Ethan's reaction to the news was not the reaction she'd expected, which was to say he didn't have one. Not visibly. She told him carefully, sitting in the main room that evening after Rose was asleep, that someone who might be related to his mother had filed a legal claim with the court and that there would be a hearing. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he looked at the table. Douglas, he said. My mother called him Douglas once. I remember because she was angry when she said it. She didn't usually say his name. Do you know why she was angry? No, I was little. He rubbed at a mark on the table with his thumb. But she was really angry, the kind she tried to hide. She wasn't good at hiding things. He paused. She was good at most things, but not that. Nora filed all of it away. The hearing is 6 weeks out. We have time to prepare. Prepare for what? To show the court what we've built here, what your life looks like. She looked at him. You'll probably be asked to speak. He looked up. Me. You're old enough that the court will want your perspective. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What do I say? The truth. She said it simply. That's all. You tell them what's true and you let that be enough. Don't try to make it more than it is. She looked at him steadily. The truth is enough, Ethan. If it isn't, we'll deal with that when we get there. But start with the truth. He nodded slowly. After he went to bed, she stayed at the table with the lamp turned low, not reading, not writing, just sitting. The wind was down tonight, one of those still, clear March nights where the cold was honest and simple, not mean. She could hear Cole moving in his room, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a drawer, the quiet sounds of a house occupied by people who had, without anyone formally announcing it, started accounting for each other. She thought about what Whitmore's letter had not said. It had not mentioned the children by name in any specific way. Not Ethan, not Rose, not any detail that suggested he knew them, had spent time with them, knew what Rose needed in the night, or how Ethan asked questions, or what either of them had been through in the last months. He'd written about his sister's children as a category, not as people. That was something. She wrote it down in the notebook she kept of useful things. The hearing was at the county seat. The road would be passable by May. 6 weeks. She did the count in her head. 6 weeks to document everything, to gather witnesses if she could find them, to learn what Cole's contact found out about Douglas Whitmore in Cheyenne, and to make the court understand that a family was not a document, that it was a thing built out of ordinary days and hard nights, and small acts nobody wrote down, and that the weight of it was real even when it wasn't visible. She closed the notebook. She went to check on Rose out of habit. The girl was sleeping, hands open this time, which was a better sign. And then she stood in the hallway between the rooms for a moment, listening to the quiet house, to the particular sound of it at rest. There was a hearing coming. There was a man in Cheyenne with reasons she didn't know yet. There was a legal system that might look at everything they'd made here and decide blood and money outweighed all of it. She went to her room and lay down and looked at the ceiling. She'd been in harder places than this. She'd been in places where the only resource she had was her own next decision. She was still here, which meant she'd made enough of those decisions correctly, and she intended to keep making them. Sleep came slower than she wanted, but it came. But Cole's contact in Cheyenne was named Archibald Tully, and his reply arrived 2 weeks after Cole's letter went out. A single page, dense with information, written in a cramped hand that suggested a man who charged by some economy that didn't include margins. Cole read it first, alone, which Nora had expected. When he brought it to her that evening, his expression had a flatness to it that she'd learned meant something had confirmed what he already suspected. She read it at the table. Douglas Whitmore was, on paper, a man of moderate commercial success, a stake in 2 trading operations in Cheyenne, a property in the better part of town, no criminal record of note. What Archibald Tully had found, and what the official record did not show, was a pattern of debts discharged in methods that several of his former business partners found irregular. 2 of those partners apparently had consulted legal counsel and then not followed through, and both of them had, within a year of their disputes with Whitmore, relocated out of Wyoming territory. There was also the matter of the children's father. Thomas Aldous, the children's father, had, according to Tully's information, received a letter from Whitmore in the autumn. A letter in which Whitmore had expressed interest in the land claim Thomas had been working in the mountains east of Harrow Creek. A letter in which Whitmore had made an offer. And according to a source Tully did not name in writing, a letter in which Whitmore had made certain representations about what might happen if Thomas chose not to sell. Thomas Aldous had gone up the mountain and not come back. Nora set the paper down slowly. She looked at Cole, who was watching her. The land claim, she said. His camp was on the east face, Cole said. I know that range. There's ore up there. Not rich, but consistent. And there's water rights from the mountain runoff that would be worth money to the right buyer. Whitmore doesn't want the children, she said. It wasn't a question. He wants the land claim. Cole's voice was flat. Children are legal heirs. If he has guardianship of the children, he controls their inheritance until they're of age. At which point, he stopped. Didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Nora thought about Ethan at the table, drawing maps from memory. Thought about Rose sleeping with her hands open. Thought about a man in Cheyenne writing a formal letter using the word welfare, like it was a thing he understood. We need this in front of the court, she said. Tully won't testify. His information has no documented source. Then we find the source. She looked at Cole. Or we find the former business partners. Or we find whoever Whitmore sent that letter through, because in my experience, men like him don't write things like that themselves. They have someone else write them. She looked back at the paper. There's a trail. There's always a trail. We just have to find it before the hearing. Cole was quiet. That's 4 weeks. I know. He looked at her steadily. You understand that if we bring this into a courtroom and we're wrong about any piece of it, it destroys the rest of the case. I know that too. She met his eyes. But we're not wrong. You know we're not wrong. A long pause. No, he said. We're not wrong. He pulled the letter back across the table. I'll write to Tully again. Tell him we need documentation or a name. I'll write to the county clerk at Cheyenne. Ask about any formal land inquiries filed against Thomas Aldous's claim in the last year. Cole looked at her. That's public record. It's public record that nobody's thought to look at yet. She was already thinking about the letter. And I'll write to Roy Lester. He needs to know that the children's father may not have simply gotten lost. Cole's jaw tightened. She watched it happen. Thomas Aldous went up that mountain because someone made going easier than staying, he said. It was the most words she'd heard him put together about something that wasn't practical, and the weight behind them was not impersonal. She looked at him for a moment. Did you know him? Not well. He came to town 3 or 4 times when I was there. Quiet man. Tried hard. He stopped. Couldn't always manage it. She thought about Ethan saying he was better in the summer. Then we do this right, she said. For him too. Cole held her gaze, and something shifted in it. Not the recomputing look this time. Something that had less calculation in it. He nodded once, short and final, and picked up his pen. They worked at the table until the lamp needed refilling, the wind outside moving around the house like something trying to find a way in, the stove low and warm, and the rest of the household asleep in the rooms beyond, and neither of them said anything else that needed saying. The 4 weeks before the hearing were the hardest kind of busy. Not the kind where you can see the work piling up and measure your progress against it, but the kind where you're pulling on threads in the dark and not knowing until the last moment whether any of them are attached to anything useful. Nora wrote 7 letters in the first 10 days. To the county clerk in Cheyenne asking about land inquiries filed against any claim on the east face of the Harrow Range. To Roy Lester laying out what Tully's information suggested about Whitmore, and asking him to formally document whatever he knew about Thomas Aldous's last weeks in the valley. To Doc Hensley requesting a written account of the children's condition when they arrived, frostbite borderline, malnourished, the kind of physical evidence that told a story about how long they'd been alone. To Francis Brewer, who was 70 and had been watching this valley for decades and whose written word carried more weight in a Wyoming courtroom than most people half his age. To Walt Pruitt, for much the same reason. Cole wrote 2 letters, both to Archibald Tully, both asking for what Tully had implied existed, a name, a document, something that connected Whitmore's interest in Thomas Aldous's land, claim to Thomas Aldous's disappearance in a way that didn't rely on inference. Tully's reply came back in 10 days, which was faster than either of them expected. Cole read it in the barn, alone. He came in for supper that evening and handed it to Nora across the table without a word, which told her before she read it that it was significant. Tully had found a man named Clarence Webb, formerly employed by one of Whitmore's trading operations, who had been present when Whitmore dictated the letter sent to Thomas Aldous. Webb had left Whitmore's employ the following spring under circumstances he described to Tully as not his choosing, and he was not, apparently, sentimental about his former employer. Webb had provided Tully with a written account of the letter's contents, not the polite version Whitmore had presumably sent, but the version that had been dictated first before the lawyer smoothed the language. The version that made clear what certain representations about what might happen actually meant. The letter to Thomas Aldous, in its original form, had not been an offer. It had been a threat dressed in the clothing of an offer, the way such things always are when they're written by men who understand legal exposure. It had named the land claim, named the children, and suggested, with the particular elegance of implied violence, that a man in Thomas's precarious financial position might find that his situation became considerably more precarious if he chose to refuse. Webb had kept a copy. He didn't say why, but Nora had theories, and all of them amounted to the same thing. A man who keeps a copy of something like that is a man who understood, at the time, that he might someday need it. She set the letter down. She looked at Cole. Will he testify? Tully says he'll come for expenses and a flat fee. Cole's voice was even. The fee isn't small. How not small? He told her. She looked at the table for a moment and did arithmetic she didn't enjoy. Then she looked up. I have half of that. Cole held her gaze. I have the rest. She started to say something and he stopped her before she got to it. It's not charity. If Whitmore wins this, he controls land on the east face that affects water access to this ranch. I have a practical interest in the outcome. It was, she knew, not entirely the full reason. But she also knew Cole well enough by now to understand that the practical reason was the one he'd accept her accepting, so she let it stand. All right, she said. We offer Webb the fee. Cole nodded and picked up his pen. The county clerk's response arrived 5 days before the hearing. It was 3 pages, dense with recorded filings, and the relevant entry was on the second page. A land inquiry had been filed against the Thomas Aldous East Face claim in October of the previous year by a party represented by a Cheyenne legal firm that had Douglas Whitmore listed among its regular clients. The inquiry was technically public record, technically routine, and had been filed 10 days after Whitmore's letter to Thomas was sent. 10 days. The letter goes out. Thomas doesn't respond within whatever private timeline Whitmore had set, and 10 days later a legal mechanism begins working against the claim. Nora put the county clerk's pages in the box with everything else and sat for a moment. The box was getting full. She'd built this case the way she'd built everything in her life, piece by piece, without anyone handing her the pieces, just looking for them in the places other people hadn't thought to look. She wasn't sure if it was enough. She was sure it was more than anyone had expected her to find. She heard Rose singing something in the next room, a song she'd made up herself, partly words and partly sounds that substituted for words she didn't know yet, the kind of singing 5-year-olds do when they're somewhere they feel safe enough to make noise. Nora closed the box and went to find her. They left for the county seat on a Wednesday morning, 2 days before the hearing, to allow for road conditions, and to give Nora time to meet with the lawyer they'd hired, a man named Arthur Gaines who practiced out of a small office 2 streets from the courthouse, and who had the cautious, measured manner of someone who had lost enough cases to take every case seriously. The 4 of them went together, which had not been the original plan. The original plan had been for Nora and Cole to go, leaving the children with Walt Pruitt and his wife, who had offered. But Ethan had come to Nora 3 evenings before departure and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets and said, without preamble, I want to come. You may be called to speak, she said. You understand that. I know. It's not easy. The court it's not designed to be comfortable. There'll be people there who are arguing against us. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. I still want to come. This is about my family. I should be there. She thought about it for a moment. Not long. All right. Rose came because Rose went where Ethan went, and there was no force on the Wyoming frontier that was going to change that. The road to the county seat was 2 days' travel, passable but rough in places where the spring thaw had done damage that hadn't been repaired yet. They took Cole's larger wagon with the canvas cover, and Nora sat on the bench beside Cole for most of it and let the children have the back. She could hear them through the canvas, Rose's commentary on everything they passed, Ethan's shorter responses, the specific rhythm of siblings who know each other well enough to communicate in shorthand. They stopped the first night at a way station, a small, functional place with 2 rooms and a communal dining table, and food that was filling, if not memorable. Cole paid for the rooms without discussion, and Nora didn't fight him on it because she was keeping careful track of what she'd need money for at the other end. After the children were asleep, she and Cole sat at the way station's small common room table with the lamp between them and went through the documents one more time. Gaines had asked for copies, and she'd made them, but she wanted to know every page well enough to speak to it from memory if she needed to. "Webb arrives tomorrow," Cole said. He'd had a telegram from Tully confirming it. "Has he ever testified before?" Tully didn't say. Cole turned one of the pages. "He'll need to hold up under questioning from Whitmore's lawyer. Men like Whitmore hire lawyers who are good at finding holes." "There isn't a hole in a man who is present and kept a copy," Nora said. "The only question is whether the court believes him." She paused. "And whether Whitmore's lawyer tries to make him look like he has a personal grudge." "He probably does have a personal grudge." "Yes, that doesn't make him wrong." Cole looked at her across the lamp. "You're good at this," he said. She looked up, at thinking through things before they happen. He wasn't flattering her. She'd learned by now that Cole didn't do flattery, that when he said something it was because he'd arrived at it through some internal process and decided it was accurate. Most people wait to see what happens, and then react. You think it out first. It's what you do when you don't have other advantages, she said. She wasn't being modest, just accurate. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the papers. "Gaines needs to lead with Webb," he said. "Get the intimidation letter into the record first, before Whitmore's side has time to frame the narrative." "I suggested that in my last letter to him." He agreed. "And the county filing, after Webb. The filing alone doesn't mean much. It's the combination of the two that shows the timeline." Cole nodded. They worked through it, back and forth, filling in the gaps. And outside the way station, the night was clear and cold, and the stars were the sharp kind that only happen at altitude, and for a while it was just the two of them at a table working through a problem together. And Nora was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was something she hadn't had before. Someone who did this with her, not for her or in spite of her, but alongside her, in the same direction. She didn't say it. It wasn't the time. She wasn't entirely sure she had the right words for it anyway. They packed up the papers at close to midnight and went to their respective rooms. And Nora lay in the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about the hearing and thought about Ethan's voice saying, "This is about my family," and thought about Rose singing in the kitchen, and eventually she slept. What? Arthur Gaines's office was small and smelled of old paper, and he was exactly as Nora had pictured him from his letters. A compact, careful man in his 50s who shook everyone's hand and looked at the children with the particular assessment of someone calculating how they'd appear to a judge. "The girl should not be in the courtroom," he said to Nora, quietly, when Rose was occupied with a folded paper Ethan was making for her. "I know. I'll arrange something." "The boy." He looked at Ethan more carefully. "How is he under pressure?" "Better than most adults." Gaines studied her for a moment. "You're confident." "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." He almost smiled. "Webb is at the hotel on Linden Street. I met with him this morning. He's motivated." He chose the word carefully. "Incredible. I think he'll hold. Whitmore's lawyer will attack his reasons for coming forward." "Yes, I've prepared for that." Gaines opened his folder. "What I want to talk through is the sequence. And I want to make sure we all understand what we're arguing and what we're not." "What do you mean?" "We're not arguing that Douglas Whitmore is a criminal." He looked at her steadily. "We don't have enough for that, and that's not our case to make. Our case is narrower, that his interest in these children is not in their interest, that his claim is motivated by financial gain rather than family concern, and that the life these children have built here is stable, loving, and far superior to what he's offering. He paused. The rest, the letter, the land filing. That's context. That's what shows the court why we should question his motives. But the heart of the case is the children themselves. Nora looked at Ethan across the room, who had finished the paper thing for Rose and was now apparently explaining something to her using hand gestures. I understand, she said. Good. Gaines looked at Cole. And you, I need you to be very measured tomorrow. You have a reputation in this county, Mr. Mercer. Cole's expression didn't change. What kind of reputation? The kind that a good opposing lawyer could use to suggest that your ranch is not an ideal environment for children. Gaines was direct about it, which Nora appreciated. I'm not saying it's warranted. I'm saying be aware of it. I'll be measured, Cole said. Gaines looked at him for a moment, apparently deciding to believe him. All right, he said. Let's go through it. Nora did not sleep well the night before the hearing. She slept in patches, an hour, then awake, then another stretch, then awake again. And she lay in the dark of the hotel room, running things through in her head the way she always did before important days, checking every piece of the argument for the weakness she hadn't found yet. She knew from experience that there was always something she hadn't fully considered, and lying awake the night before was when she tended to find it. What she found, at around 2 a.m, was that she'd been thinking about the case as an argument to win when it was also, at its center, something personal. A statement about what those children deserved, made in a room full of people, some of whom had already made up their minds. She couldn't control the outcome. She could only control how clearly and honestly she spoke. She'd told Ethan the same thing. Tell the truth. Let it be enough. She needed to take her own advice. The courthouse was a solid stone building on the main street of the county seat, 2 stories, with the permanent, serious smell of institutional wood and old documents. They arrived early. Nora, Cole, Ethan, and Gaines, with Rose left at the hotel in the care of the innkeeper's wife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Farrow, who had looked at Rose for about 30 seconds and declared her manageable, which Rose would probably have objected to if she'd understood it. The courtroom was smaller than Nora had imagined. She'd built it up in her head during the weeks of preparation into something imposing, and the reality was a room with wooden benches, a raised bench for the judge, 2 tables facing it, and tall windows that let in a gray morning light. Judge Harlan Cobb was in his 60s, white-haired, with a face that gave nothing away. Not hostile, not warm, just present. The face of a man who had learned to listen before deciding. Douglas Whitmore was already seated at the opposing table when they came in. She recognized him immediately. Not because she'd seen him before, but because he looked exactly like the letter sounded. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the specific way of Cheyenne commerce, silver in his dark hair, a face that was handsome in the way some deceptive things are handsome, smooth, composed, constructed. He had a lawyer beside him who looked younger and hungrier, a man named Farrell, whose reputation Gaines had briefed her on. Aggressive, good with juries, had a habit of making witnesses feel foolish. Whitmore looked at Nora when she came in. His gaze went to her coat, her wrists, the particular quality of her physical presence, and she saw the calculation in it, the same calculation she'd spent her whole adult life watching people perform. She looked back at him without expression and sat down. Ethan, beside her, was very still. Are you all right? She said quietly. Yes, he said, and then, after a moment, he looks at people like there's something to buy. She had no argument with that. Gaines opened with the petition, the documented history of the children's situation from the night of the blizzard to the present, assembled into a factual narrative that moved forward without embellishment. He called Doc Hensley first, who testified by written deposition about the children's condition on arrival. He called Walt Pruitt, who had come in person and whose broad, honest face in the witness seat was probably worth more to the case than his actual words. Walt said, in the plain-spoken way he said everything, that in his 30 years in this valley, he had not seen a person work harder to take care of 2 children who had no obligation to be taken care of, and that in his opinion, a person's character showed most clearly in what they did when nobody was making them do it. Farrell cross-examined Walt with polished efficiency, asking about Nora's financial situation, the size of her original house, her widowed status, the fact that she had no children of her own. Walt answered each question with the same equanimity. Did Nora Whitaker have limited financial resources? She managed what she had carefully. Did she live alone before this? She did. Was it perhaps the case that a single woman with limited resources and no experience raising children was not ideally positioned to— Walt had interrupted at that point and said, with a patience that somehow made Farrell look worse, I've known a lot of people in this territory who looked ideal on paper and turned out to be nothing in practice. What I can tell you is what I've seen. Gaines called Cole next. Cole sat in the witness seat with the measured quality he'd promised and answered questions about the ranch, the property, the stable income, the 3 additional rooms, the children's daily life. He was precise without being rigid. When Gaines asked him to describe what the children's life on the ranch actually looked like day to day, Cole was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet she recognized. And then he said, Ethan helps with the animals in the morning. He asks questions until he understands something, and then he does it without being asked again. Rose talks through most of breakfast and is generally better informed about everything on the property than I am. Matthias Eterum ihres skin. He stopped. They're good kids. They deserve to stay somewhere that knows them. Farrell's cross-examination of Cole was sharper. Clearly, the young lawyer had read about Cole's reputation and planned to use it. He asked about the incident with Frank Dunning, about Cole's minimal community ties, about his late wife. Cole answered each question with the same flat evenness. When Farrell asked whether it was perhaps true that Mr. Mercer's history of social isolation suggested a household environment that might not be emotionally nourishing for young children, Cole looked at the lawyer for a moment and said, You'd have to ask the children. Gaines called Clarence Webb. Webb was a compact man in his 40s who looked, when he took the seat, like a man who had made a decision and was living with the discomfort of it without changing his mind. He told his account clearly, the letter, the dictation, what had been said, the copy he'd kept. He explained, without being asked, why he'd kept it, because he'd understood when he heard it that the man who dictated it would eventually do something for which someone would need evidence. Farrell went at Webb hard. He questioned Webb's motives, his departure from Whitmore's employ, the gap between the event and Webb coming forward, whether a man with a personal grievance against the defendant was a reliable witness to anything. Webb answered without flinching. He said, I kept a copy of the letter the day it was written. I didn't know these children or this woman. I kept it because I knew what kind of man Douglas Whitmore was, and I knew that eventually someone would need it. If that's a grudge, then yes, I have one. That doesn't change what the letter says. Gaines introduced the county land filing as a document, walking the court through the timeline. Letter to Thomas Aldis, 10 days, filing against his claim. The judge examined it without expression. Then Gaines called Ethan. The boy walked to the witness seat with his hands at his sides and sat down, and he looked at the judge the way he'd looked at everything since Nora had known him, directly, without performance, with the particular composure of someone who has already been through the worst thing and is therefore less afraid of formal rooms than most people expect. The judge leaned forward slightly. Son, you understand you're here to answer questions about where you want to live and who you want to live with. Yes, sir. You're not in trouble. This isn't about anything you did wrong. It's about what's best for you and your sister. You understand that? Yes, sir. All right. You speak up if you don't understand a question. Gaines's questions were simple and direct, which was the right approach. He asked Ethan about the ranch, about daily life, about Cole and Nora. Ethan answered in the precise, economical way he did everything. Yes, he helped with the animals. Yes, he was continuing his education. Yes, Rose had nightmares sometimes, but they were getting better. When Gaines asked how he would describe Nora Whitaker's role in his life, Ethan was quiet for a moment and then said, She came out in a blizzard when nobody else did. And then she didn't stop. He paused. I don't know what word you'd use for that, but I know what it means. Farrell's cross-examination was more careful with Ethan than it had been with the adults. Farrell wasn't stupid enough to push hard against a child, but he tried. He asked Ethan whether he'd met Douglas Whitmore, whether he knew much about him, whether it was possible that a life in Cheyenne with a biological relative might offer opportunities the ranch couldn't. Ethan looked at Farrell with the expression of someone deciding how to answer something he finds not quite honest. "He's never met us," Ethan said. "He didn't write to us. He wrote to the court." He paused. "Nora came to find us in the snow before she knew our names." A silence in the room. Not dramatic, just the particular quality of a truth that doesn't need elaboration. Farrell said, "No further questions." Whitmore took the stand after lunch, and his lawyer guided him through a presentation that was polished in all the ways you'd expect. The family connection emphasized, his resources outlined, his home in Cheyenne described in terms designed to sound stable and generous. He was good at it. He had the smooth manner of a man who had performed versions of this exact thing many times before. But the letter was in evidence. The land filing was in evidence. And when Gaines cross-examined him, quietly, methodically, without theatrics, the gaps between what Whitmore said and what the documents showed became visible in the way that gaps always become visible when you stop filling them with words. Gaines asked whether Whitmore had corresponded with Thomas Aldous in the autumn prior to his disappearance. Whitmore said he had a vague recollection of some business correspondence. Gaines produced the letter. Whitmore acknowledged dictating it. Gaines asked whether the land claim had come up. Whitmore said he might have expressed interest in a business proposition. Gaines asked about the 10-day timeline between the letter and the legal filing. Whitmore said he couldn't speak to every detail of his business dealings. "Can you speak to whether you visited these children, or wrote to them, or made any attempt to contact them before filing a custody claim with this court?" A pause. "I was not aware of their precise location until... Did you make any attempt to contact them before the legal filing?" Another pause. "Not directly, no." "Had you met them, either of them, before today?" "Not in person." "Had you corresponded with Ethan or Rose Aldous, or their guardian, or anyone on their behalf, to express concern for their welfare before filing this claim?" The pause this time was longer. "No," Whitmore said. Gaines looked at the judge for a moment and then back at Whitmore. "No further questions." The judge did not rule that day. He said he would take the matter under consideration and issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. "Standard procedure," Gaines said. "Nothing to read into either way." They walked out of the courthouse into an April afternoon that was cool and clean, and Nora stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. Beside her, Cole stood with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the street. Ethan was on her other side, quiet. "You did well," she said to Ethan. He shrugged, which was his version of accepting a compliment. "I just said what was true." "That's what doing well means in a room like that." He looked at her sideways. "Do you think it worked?" She thought about Whitmore on the stand, about the pause before no, about Judge Cobb's face when the letter was introduced, the way something shifted in it that wasn't quite readable. "I think we said everything we needed to say," she said. "That's all we can control." Ethan nodded slowly and looked at the street. Cole said without looking at either of them, "Let's go get Rose before she talks the innkeeper's wife into something." Ethan made a sound that was almost a laugh, the first one Nora had heard from him in days. They walked down the steps together, the four of them, into the ordinary afternoon, and behind them the courthouse sat solid and gray and full of all the arguments they had made and all the truth they had put into the record, and they let it sit there while they went to find Rose, who had, as it turned out, already reorganized Mrs. Farrow's kitchen shelf system and was very pleased about it. The waiting was the hardest part, but they were at least waiting together. The 2 weeks after the hearing moved the way time moves when you're waiting for something that will either save or break what you've built. Slowly during the days, then suddenly gone when you look back at them. Nora kept herself busy the way she always did when she had no other way to manage uncertainty. She worked. She cleaned things that didn't need cleaning. She reorganized the supply shelves in the kitchen twice. She started teaching Ethan fractions, which he picked up faster than she expected, and which required her to stay 2 lessons ahead of him at all times, which was its own useful occupation. Cole said nothing about the waiting. He went about the ranch the way he went about everything, steadily, without commentary. But she noticed he was checking the road toward town more often than usual, and that he'd taken to coming in from the barn earlier in the evenings and sitting at the table rather than retiring to his room. She didn't remark on it. Some things communicated themselves better without words, and this was one of them. Rose didn't know what they were waiting for, not precisely. Nora had explained the hearing to her in the simple terms available to a 5-year-old. Some people needed to make sure Rose and Ethan were in a good place, and they'd checked. And now everyone was deciding. Rose had considered this for a moment, and then asked whether deciding people needed biscuits, because she'd seen Nora make biscuits when things were hard and had drawn a reasonable conclusion. Nora had said that was a solid instinct, and they'd made biscuits. And the biscuits had been slightly burned on the bottom because neither of them was paying close enough attention, and they ate them anyway. The letter came on a Thursday, brought by a rider from the county seat rather than through the regular post, which told Nora before she touched the envelope that the judge had sent it with some intention of it arriving promptly. She was in the yard when the rider came. Cole was somewhere in the east pasture. She took the envelope and stood with it for a moment in the April morning, the sun doing its best against a wind that hadn't gotten the seasonal memo yet, and she thought, whatever it says, you'll figure out the next thing. She'd been telling herself that for months, and it had been true every time, and she had to believe it would be true now too. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Judge Harlan Cobb's written rulings were apparently not long documents. This one ran to 2 pages. She read it once quickly to get the answer, and then she read it again more slowly to understand the shape of it. The petition for guardianship filed by Nora Whitaker and Cole Mercer was granted. The claim filed by Douglas Whitmore was denied. The judge's reasoning occupied most of the second page, and it was the reasoning she found herself reading a third time, because it said something she hadn't expected a legal document to say, at least not in these words. Cobb had written that the court found the evidence of Whitmore's financial motivation credible and troubling, and that the timeline of the land filing against Thomas Aldis's claim, in combination with the testimony of Clarence Webb regarding the nature of the correspondence sent to the children's father, raised concerns that the court was not in a position to ignore. He had noted that while these concerns did not rise to a criminal finding, they were sufficient to cast substantial doubt on the claim that Whitmore's interest in the children was, as stated, a matter of family feeling. But it was the paragraph after that which she read 3 times. Cobb had written that beyond the questions raised about Whitmore's motives, the court had found the evidence of the children's present situation to be, in his word, compelling. He cited the testimony of multiple community witnesses. He cited the documented record of the children's care over the preceding months. He cited specifically the testimony of Ethan Aldis, which he described as among the most honest accounts he had heard in years of practice, and which had demonstrated clearly that the children did not merely reside in the proposed household, but belonged to it, in the fullest sense of that word. Nora put the letter down. She sat very still for a moment. Outside the window, a bird was doing something optimistic in the spruce trees. The stove ticked. She'd been holding herself together for so long, through the storm, through Whitmore's letter, through 4 weeks of preparation, through the hearing itself, through 2 weeks of waiting, that she hadn't entirely understood how much she'd been holding until the moment she felt some of it come loose. It didn't come loose dramatically. She didn't cry, or at least not in any way she'd have called crying. Her eyes went hot and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, and then she took a long, unsteady breath, and then she was all right again, mostly. She heard Cole's boots on the porch before the door opened. She'd learned the specific sound of his step months ago, the slightly heavier fall of the left boot where the heel was worn, and she looked up when he came in. He looked at her face, then at the letter on the table. He didn't ask. She slid it across to him. He stood and read it, and she watched his face while he did. Cole Mercer's face was not built for visible emotion, but she knew it well enough now to read what was underneath the surface, the small give at the corner of his jaw, the thing his eyes did when something mattered to him more than he intended to show. He put the letter back on the table without speaking. "Well," Nora said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Well," he said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, and there was something in that moment, not neat, not cinematic, just 2 people who had been through a long, difficult thing together, arriving at the other side of it, and finding themselves still standing, and finding each other still there. "We should tell the children," she said. Yes. Neither of them moved immediately. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because the moment before telling them was the last moment it was only hers and Cole's, the last moment before it became something they all carried together, and she wanted to feel the weight of it for just 1 more minute. Then Cole said quietly, You did this. She started to object and he stopped her. You went out in the blizzard when everyone else was inside. You found them. You pushed the petition through when the whole town thought it was pointless. You found Webb. You built the case. He looked at her steadily. I signed the papers and provided the property. You did the rest. You came with me to the county seat, she said. You sat in that courtroom. You paid for Webb. That's not the same thing. It is, actually. She held his gaze. You can say it's practical interest all you want, Cole. I know what it was. He looked away first, out the window, at the spruce trees, at whatever middle distance men look at when they're not ready to look at the thing directly. She let him look. She'd learned that about him, when to press and when to wait. The way you learn the terrain of any place you've decided to stay in. After a moment, he looked back. The boy's in the barn, he said. She almost smiled. I'll get Rose, but... Ethan's reaction was not what she expected, which was the thing about Ethan. She'd stopped being surprised that he surprised her, but she hadn't stopped being surprised by the specific form it took. She'd expected relief, maybe. Some version of a 10-year-old's joy, contained but real. What he did instead was stand in the barn doorway with Cole's letter in his hands and read it twice, very carefully, and then he looked up and his face was doing something complicated that she couldn't entirely parse. Not unhappy, not the face of bad news, but not simple happiness either. Something layered. It's permanent, he said. Guardianship until you're of age, she said. Which means until you're 18, you're ours and we're yours, legally and in every other way. He nodded, looked at the letter again. Ethan, she said. What is it? He was quiet for a moment. Cole was standing back, giving room, which was something she'd noticed he'd gotten better at over these months, understanding when to step back and let things happen. My pa, Ethan said. Just that, at first. She waited. They're not going to find him. He said it the way he'd said his mother was dead, with the worn edges, with the resignation of someone who'd already had the private conversation and arrived at the only conclusion available. I know they're not. I think I've known since the second week. You might be right, she said honestly. He nodded again. So this is... He stopped. Tried again. He tried. He really did try. It got too big for him. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth in a gesture that was, without either of them knowing it, almost exactly what Nora had done at the kitchen table an hour ago. I just don't want him to be forgotten. Something moved through Nora's chest that she didn't have a name for. Not pity, not sympathy, something more specific than either. She thought about a man who'd gone up the mountain alone carrying more than he could carry, trying to find a way through and not making it back. She thought about the letter that had probably accelerated that decision. She thought about Ethan holding Rose in a hollow in the rocks, keeping her warm for 3 days, doing the thing his father couldn't. He won't be forgotten, she said. Not in this house. Ethan looked at her. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't crying. Not quite. You mean that? I mean that. Your father is part of who you are, which means he's part of this family too, even if he's not here. A long pause. Then Ethan folded the letter carefully, the same careful, deliberate way he did everything, and put it in his shirt pocket. Okay, he said. Rose, who had been listening to all of this from Nora's hip with the particular patience of a child who understands more than she's supposed to, said, Ethan, we have a home now. He looked at his sister. Something in his face went through a change that was hard to watch without feeling it. The last of whatever he'd been holding back, moving through him, leaving something cleaner on the other side. Yeah, he said. We do. Deep. The news moved through Harrow Creek the way news moves through small places, faster than logic should allow, and accompanied by the full spectrum of human response. Walt Pruitt shook Cole's hand when they came to town the following Saturday, and then, in what was clearly an impulsive decision, clapped him on the shoulder, which appeared to startle Cole considerably. Francis Brewer sent a note that said simply, right outcome. Well done. Edna Coffey said nothing directly to Nora, but was observed to make a point of speaking kindly to the children when they passed, which Nora chose to read as the closest thing to an apology she was likely to receive, and accepted it on those terms. Roy Lester told Nora, somewhat awkwardly, that the county had referred Whitmore's conduct to the territorial authorities in light of the evidence entered at the hearing, and that while he couldn't say what would come of it, it wouldn't be nothing. She thanked him. She didn't tell him that she'd sent a copy of Webb's account, the county filing timeline, and her own written summary of events to the territorial marshal's office 2 days after the hearing, on the principle that important information shouldn't sit in one place. She'd done it quietly, without announcement, the way she did most things that mattered. The spring that came to the Harrow Creek Valley that year had the quality of something that had been delayed long enough that it arrived all at once. The snow retreating in visible stages, the mud season brief and then done, the grass coming up green and sudden in the low pastures in a way that made the whole valley look like it had changed its mind about itself. Cole put Ethan to work on the fence line repair that always followed winter, and Nora watched from the porch some mornings as the two of them moved along the east border of the property, Cole with his longer stride, Ethan learning to match it, both of them talking in the sparse, functional way that was their particular language. There was something in that image she returned to many times afterward. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. Two people walking a fence line in the spring morning, one big and one not yet, exchanging words about posts and wire and the way the ground settled after a hard winter. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. And ordinary was what she'd been working toward the whole time, she realized. Not the courtroom, not the petition, not the documents and the letters and the cold ride to the county seat. Those were just the obstacles between here and ordinary. The thing itself was this: the fence line, the morning, the boy learning the land that was now his to know. Rose had, by May, appointed herself the definitive authority on the ranch's 2 barn cats and several of the more approachable horses, and had developed a relationship with Cole that Nora found quietly delightful to observe. Rose spoke to Cole the way she spoke to everyone, without filter, without calculation, with the full force of whatever she happened to be thinking, and Cole, who had spent years armoring himself against most forms of human contact, appeared to have no particular defense against 5-year-olds. He answered her questions. He let her follow him. On one occasion, Nora came out to the barn to find Rose sitting on the top rail of the corral and Cole standing below, ostensibly watching the horses, while Rose delivered an extended monologue about something she'd dreamed the night before. He wasn't uncomfortable. That was the thing. He was just present. She didn't say anything. She went back inside and let it be. She and Cole had a conversation in late May that had been coming for a while. Not the only conversation of that kind. They'd been having smaller versions of it for months, without either of them naming what they were doing, both of them circling the same territory from opposite directions. This one happened on the porch after supper, after the children were inside, in the particular evening light that comes to Wyoming in late spring. Gold and long and slow, the mountains turning colors they didn't have earlier in the day. He'd been fixing a hinge on the porch rail, and she'd brought him coffee and then stayed, and they'd been quiet together for a while, which was something they'd gotten good at over the winter. The good kind of quiet. The kind that doesn't require filling. "I want to say something," he said after a while. She waited. When you came to my ranch in February and asked me to sign the petition, I wasn't doing you a favor." He was looking at the mountains, not at her. "I told you it was practical interest, the water rights, the property argument." He stopped. "That wasn't the full reason." "I know," she said. He looked at her then. "You knew." "I had a fairly good idea." Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, but related to it. "Then why did you let me say it?" "Because you needed a way in that didn't require you to admit you cared about something before you were ready to." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "That's not a criticism. It's just how I understood the situation." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "My wife," he said, and then stopped, started differently. "After Eleanor died, I decided that the problem was wanting things. That if you wanted things, specific things, people, outcomes, you gave the world a way to hurt you, and the easiest solution was to stop wanting them." "That's not a solution," she said. "That's just a longer route to the same place." "I know that now." He held her gaze. I'm not good at this. At whatever this is. I want you to know that going in. I'm not easy to live with, and I know it, and I've been told it, and I'm not sure how much of it I can change." "I don't need you to be easy," she said. "I've never needed anyone to be easy. I need them to be honest, and I need them to still be there in the morning. She paused. You've been both of those things since February. He was quiet. The mountains went deeper gold. I'm not asking for anything immediate, she said. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just saying. She looked at her coffee cup, looked back up at him. I came to Wyoming to find the next thing. I think I might have found it, and I think you know that. And I think you feel something similar, or you wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation instead of being in the barn doing something practical. Cole looked at her, then he reached across and put his hand over hers on the porch rail. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just placed it there and let it stay. His hand was big and rough and warm from the coffee cup, and she felt it through her palm and through her wrist and somewhere further in. They sat like that until the light was almost gone. Neither of them said anything else, because nothing else needed saying. Not tonight. They had time for the rest of it, and they both knew it, and there was something in knowing that which was its own kind of completion. Nora was not someone who spent much time looking backward. It was a quality she'd developed young and sharpened through necessity. The habit of noting what was useful from the past and then turning to face forward, because forward was where the next thing was. But she found, that summer, that she looked back more than she used to. Not with regret. With something more like reckoning. She thought about this woman who had arrived in Wyoming 2 years ago with $20 and a stubborn refusal to leave. Who had been told, in more ways than she could count, that she wasn't enough for this country. Who had been looked over, talked past, dismissed in rooms where she was standing right there. Who had been assessed by the width of her wrists and the fit of her coat and found insufficient. She thought about what it felt like to carry that, how it becomes its own kind of weight after a while. Not the rejection itself, but the slow accumulation of it, the way you start to hear those voices even when nobody's saying anything, the way you sometimes catch yourself preemptively making yourself smaller, justifying your presence before anyone questions it, explaining why you belong in spaces you have every right to be in. She didn't think she'd ever be completely free of that. She was honest enough with herself to know the difference between having resolved a thing and having survived it. But there was a difference now in the weight of it. It sat differently. What she had figured out, slowly, imperfectly, through the long winter and the storm and the hearing and everything before and after, was that the people who'd told her she wasn't enough had been working with the wrong measure. They'd been measuring size, means, appearance, the conventional markers of sufficiency. They hadn't been measuring the thing that actually mattered in the specific crisis that arrived. The thing that had mattered was this. When the blizzard came and the tracks were in the snow, she had gone. Not because she was fearless. She'd been afraid. She remembered the cold and the uncertain footing and the knowledge that if something went wrong, there was no one looking for her. She'd gone afraid, which is different from going fearless, and she'd come to believe it's actually the harder thing. That was what she'd want Rose to know someday, she thought. Not that the fear goes away, not that the world stops underestimating you, but that you don't need to wait for either of those things before you move. You just go. The summer passed the way good summers pass when you're busy enough that you don't have time to watch them go. The fence line got repaired. The garden that Nora planted in June produced tomatoes and beans and rather more squash than anyone wanted. Ethan turned 12 in July and requested, for the occasion, that he be taught how to do the ranch accounts, which Cole agreed to with a look on his face that said he understood exactly the kind of person Ethan was going to become and was already deciding how he felt about it. Rose's nightmares stopped almost entirely. She still had them occasionally. They might not be done with her yet, and Nora had accepted that as a real possibility rather than a problem to be solved. But the clusters had become singular nights, and the singular nights had become weeks apart, and the weeks had stretched into a month and then longer. Rose slept with her hands open and her face relaxed, and her body taking up as much of the bed as a 5-year-old could claim, which was considerably more than the space she technically occupied. One evening in August, Ethan came to find Nora while she was on the porch shelling beans. He sat on the step below her and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was working up to something. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "Why did you do it?" "Actually, not the practical reasons." He looked at his hands. "You didn't have to go out that night. Nobody would have blamed you for staying inside." Nora shelled a handful of beans and thought about it honestly. She thought about the tracks in the snow and what she'd known when she saw them, and what it had felt like to stand in Walt's Mercantile while Roy Lester told her it was probably deer. Because Roy Lester looked at me and made a decision about what I was capable of, she said, and I'd been on the other end of that enough times to know what it feels like. And I knew if I was wrong and they were just deer tracks, the only thing I'd lost was a cold walk. She paused. And I knew if I was right. She stopped, looked at the mountains. You can't unknow something, she said. Once you know there might be two kids in the snow, you can't pretend you don't know it. You have to become someone who didn't go out, or you have to go out. She looked at him. I didn't want to be that other person. Ethan was quiet for a while. I'm glad you didn't want to be that person, he said finally. Me too, she said. He stayed on the step for a while longer, not talking, just present, and she shelled the rest of the beans, and the evening came in gold and slow and easy across the valley. And somewhere in the barn, Rose was doing something that involved periodic loud announcements to the cats. And Cole's boots were on the kitchen floor inside the door, and the mountains stood the way they always stood, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. And Nora sat in the middle of all of it and felt, with something as close to certainty as she ever let herself have, that she had found what she'd come here looking for. Not the life she'd planned. Nothing like the life she'd planned. Something harder than that, and less comfortable, and more complicated, and more real, built out of a blizzard and two children in a hollow in the rocks, and a man who said, I'm not good at this, like it was a warning, and turned out to be wrong about himself in the most important ways. Built out of ordinary days, mostly. That was the thing nobody told you, that the life you're trying to make is mostly ordinary days, and that ordinary is not a consolation prize. Ordinary is the whole point. Ordinary is the thing you were fighting for when you were out in the storm. The specific, daily, imperfect, completely irreplaceable ordinary of people who belong to each other. She'd gone out in the blizzard for two children she didn't know. She'd come home to a family she hadn't planned. And she understood, sitting on that porch in the August evening, that sometimes the most important thing you'll ever do starts with nothing more than the willingness to go when everyone else has decided to stay inside. Not because you're braver, not because you're stronger, just because you looked at what you knew and decided it was enough to move. It was always enough to move. The beans were done. The light was almost gone. Inside, the house was warm and lit and making the sounds that houses make when they are genuinely, fully lived in. Not the sounds of a place being occupied, but the sounds of a place that knows the people inside it. Nora went in.